During your confirmation, I'm going to switch to Syria here. During the confirmation hearing, January 2013, you were asked about the situation in Syria. You stated, every day that goes by, it gets worse. I specifically asked you about Putin's support of Assad in Syria. At the time of your confirmation hearing, there were more than 60,000 individuals estimated to have been killed in the crisis in Syria. The estimate this past weekend is that it's now up to 470,000 Syrians killed in the crisis of Syria. So that's since the day of your confirmation hearings to now, and that was the numbers were in The Economist and the national and the international surveys on this. That's about 300 more killed every day over the last 3 years. So Russia continues to support the Assad regime. It's now bombing civilians and opposition groups in Syria. Putin's attempting to change the battlefield dynamics to bolster the Assad regime, to weaken the opposition in terms of anything related to peace. His support of the Assad regime includes bombing civilians, bombing opposition groups. The current edition of The Economist article is titled, "Vladimir Putin's War in Syria, Why Would He Stop Now?" It says both of Aleppo's main hospitals were systematically destroyed by Russian airstrikes last year. They said nobody should be surprised that despite signing the agreement, Russia would continue its airstrikes against those it regards as terrorists, which they then point out is an elastic term for Putin. Today's New York Times editorial, relying again on an unreliable Mr. Putin. He says Putin, a ceasefire to him is a tactic, even a smokescreen, not a goal. The Economist says the only puzzle is what John Kerry, America's Secretary of State, thought he could achieve through his agreement with Mr. Lavrov. So I would say after decimating opponents of the Assad regime with its bombing, Russia has now made a joint statement with the U.S. That it will agree to a cessation of hostilities February 27th. I mean, to me, the only thing Russia has been consistent with is failing to keep its word. What consequences, specifically what consequences do you support imposing upon Russia if it violates the ceasefire agreement and it is just a smokescreen or some kind of a charade?
Well, in answer to the question, what does John Kerry think he could achieve?
And the consequences for Russia if they do violate.
Right. My job, the job of everybody in the State Department, is to try to, war is the absence of failure of diplomacy. And our job is to try to see if there is a way to bring this to an end. I'm not sitting here naively vouching for the fact that this is going to work. But the alternative is that I sit in my office and I go visit a bunch of countries while the war rages on and nobody makes an effort to stop it. That's the alternative. You'd be criticizing me if I was doing that. You'd say, why aren't you doing something to end the war? Why isn't there a diplomacy to try to find a solution? Now, it is a well-known fact that I have also advocated for strong efforts to support the opposition, strong efforts to make sure we have the leverage that we need to be able to achieve something. And there is a significant discussion taking place now about Plan B in the event that we don't succeed at the table. So, look, put yourself in President Putin's shoes. Yeah, he can drop bombs and he can move the battlefield and he has changed it for Assad, no question about it. He has had a better impact for Assad. But is that going to end the war? The answer is no. And I think President Putin is smart enough to understand that if he just sits there over a period of time, those people who have supported the opposition will get different weapons, more weapons, and they will continue this fight. And you can wind up with a Syria that is utterly destroyed without a capacity to put it back together again, which we have today. You know, that's happened before. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote about Carthage, They made a desert and called it peace. So you can make a desert in the desert and call it what you want, but I'm telling you, this war will not end with Assad there. It just won't end as long as Assad is there. So President Putin can bring in more. He can, start additional bombing, but I assure you that because of the sectarian nature of this, if he thinks he's going to be better off fighting on behalf of a dictator who's driven most of his people out of the country or into refugee status, killed a bunch of them, if he thinks he's going to be better off with supporting Hezbollah and the IRGC and Iran and Assad against an increasingly sectarian divide that is defined by Shia and Sunni, that is a very, very dangerous
I'm over my time, Mr. Secretary, but it does seem that there are no consequences for Putin's violation of the ceasefire. And I've not heard one from you with regard to this administration.
Well, there are a number of things being talked about right now. I don't think it's the moment to be throwing a lot of, I think that it's out there and people know what they are, but I think this is a moment to try to see whether or not we can make this work, not to find ways to preordain its failure and start talking about all the downsides of what we're going to do afterwards.
Because UN Ambassador Samantha Power, this past year talked about all of the failures of Russia or the violations of Russia with ceasefires in Ukraine. It just seems to be we're seeing this picture again.
Well, let's see if we do, and then let's see what Plan B is or isn't, if that's what it takes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.